Welcome to Module 2 in the Family and Community Assessment course. There are two presentations in this module. Part 1 deals with the nature of community and community assessment, and Part 2 focuses in on the issue of health disparities in the community. So let's continue on with Part 1. This World Health Organization definition of community is very comprehensive, and it includes many specific elements of community experience. So a community is a group of people often living in a defined geographical area who may share a common culture, values and norms, and are arranged in a social structure according to relationships which the community has developed over a period of time. Members of a community gain their personal and social identity by sharing common beliefs, values, and norms which have been developed by the community in the past and may be modified in the future. When you read this definition, the major themes that come out include a focus on common values and beliefs and the fact that it takes time to develop a community. Here are some more specific definitions that we use in community nursing practice. They focus in on some of those specific themes that you heard in that World Health Organization definition in the previous slide. To understand, I'm going to tell the story of the Larson neighborhood here in Jacksonville and apply these definitions to that example. So, geographically, Larson is a small neighborhood in the middle of Jacksonville, and it is deemed an official neighborhood by the city and has very specific boundaries. There are many different aggregates of people who live in Larson, people that have those common characteristics. It's diverse, but you have groups that are white, black, Hispanic, and very few people who are refugees from Myanmar, so from Asia. In terms of housing, there are aggregates who live in very well-kept houses and some who live in very run-down houses. And of course, there are also mobile homes. There are people who are owners and people who are renters. The majority of people here are very poor, and many have multiple unmet needs for health care. As far as a special interest or resource community, there are long-time and transient residents here, but many of the long-time residents are involved in the Larson Neighborhood Association. There's also a local church that is outside of Larson but works with them to run an outreach program in their community center. And they bring church services and food distribution regularly, as well as providing activities such as a mobile dental clinic this summer. The UNF nursing students work with both groups to meet the needs for access to health care in Larson. As far as a community of problem ecology goes, many residents in Larson do not have access to clean city water, and their water is contaminated with multiple toxins. The neighborhood association, the church, and their city councilwoman is working to provide them access to clean water. So there are more perspectives or different ways to conceptualize a community besides these. This example of the Lindas provides a window into how a community evolves. So founded in 1987 by two good friends named Linda, they gathered names from many different sources and brought together 160 Lindas from all over the United States. So they had that first Linda convention in 1987. Currently, the membership is very international, and they've only missed 1 year of convention since 1987. They come together for fun, and also they have common purposes, such as to raise money for projects. One of their projects is a scholarship fund for candidates named Linda. So this group went from being an aggregate of women with the same name, but no other connections, to a community with multiple elements, sharing interests, solving problems, and supporting each other through everyday life, and primarily just having a lot of fun. So who is our patient and our client? Well, if you think of that ecological model and the focus on how circumstances at each level affect the other levels, then think about focusing in on that community level. So in Larson, the community or neighborhood is seeking to meet the needs of the individuals and families for clean water. So it's reaching out to those lower levels. Their efforts are affected by funding from the city, particularly at the political level, above the community level. So their focus is on providing clean water to the whole neighborhood, not just certain individuals or families. So the community is that client that we're dealing with, that whole neighborhood. When we talk about community as partner, we're talking about our working relationship with the community. We are there to do with rather than to do to the partner. So we don't come into the community and talk to partners, those organizations and individual residents, and tell them what they need to do to be healthier. We tell them what their problems are and what they need to do. We work with them as partners, and partners come together. Everyone has different knowledge, different expertise to bring to the table. And everyone is active at all phases of community assessment, intervention. So in Larson, all the parties work together that we talked about before to solve the problem of contaminated water. The city councilwoman brings information about the political process that determines funding for the project. And she works with some residents to write a grant to obtain funding. The local residents bring knowledge that many people are currently filling containers with water at spigots in the local parks. And the neighborhood association and the church use that information to make a plan to provide clean water at the outreach center. And then our UNF nursing students held a screening event where they also educated residents about the toxins that are in their water and their specific health effects. So by working as partners to assess and act on the problem, their efforts were more effective, and at the same time, they were acting as a healthy community. So healthy communities are where people come together to make their community better for themselves, their friends, their neighbors, and others in the community. So why do we assess the health of a community? Well, certainly to understand health problems and challenges, but also to look at the strengths and the gains in health status that have been made. Communities' perceptions about health-related issues are very important because we must work on the community's identified needs. We use data and information to establish those priorities for what needs to be dealt with first. And then, of course, the data information helps us satisfy mandates, such as those saying what kind of information we need to write a grant, but other requirements. Now, there are two phases to community assessment: defining the community and collecting and interpreting the data. So community assessment involves getting to know and understand the community in different ways. In the first phase, we look at the who, what, why, and how of community in terms of the definition. Now, in terms of Larson, we've already discussed who, what, and why of community assessment, but let's talk about how they actually did the assessment. So data gathering and data generation are the two major ways that assessment data is collected. Data gathering is about compiling information that already exists. So we collect demographic and some of the vital statistic information from the US Census database. We look at previous surveys, such as those collected from the National Center for Health Statistics, like the Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. And then we go to Florida Charts, which is the database for the state and local health department, to get information about things like the leading causes of death and rates of chronic illness. Data generation, then, is about information that does not already exist, but it's collected from the community and with the community. So there are a number of different methods that we go about actually collecting data or generating information. The windshield survey is the first one. And by driving a vehicle around the community and observing things in the community, you can get a really good idea about one aspect of community health. Now, for your community notebook, the second chapter, you will conduct a windshield survey around the community and on the map that we gave you, along with your family case study. So when you're driving around, you'll look for certain characteristics that you'll see in the data collection tool that's available for you. So in Larson, UNF students conducted a windshield survey, and they observed the diversity of housing types and conditions, looking at then the environmental health challenges that are faced in Larson. That's just about observing. Participant observation is an assessment that's done by observing while participating in local activities. So you're observing community resident interaction in that way. So in Larson, the UNF students participated in neighborhood association meetings and food distributions through the church. And they not only became aware of who are the formal and informal leaders and where the conflicts were, they were able to use that information then to better their own participation in the future. With key informant interviews, key informants are people who are familiar with and interact with the community on a regular basis. They don't have to be residents, but they do have to know the community well. For example, representatives from the health department provided key information about those specific toxins in the water in Larson. But there was one resident who was a particularly good key informant. She lived in the neighborhood. She also attended the church that sponsors the outreach center and was the president of the neighborhood association. In other community assessments, key informants might be the community of police, fire department representatives, and business owners. Focus groups are groups of about 6 to 12 people who come together to talk about community issues. The neighborhood association held multiple focus group sessions in the neighborhood, bringing together residents to get a group perspective on their experience of water contamination. By getting this group perspective, you get a much richer and powerful story that tells the story as a whole for the community. Surveys are then conducted to collect data from individual members of the community. So when the UNF students held the screening event, they gave a survey to residents as they came in to find out their perceptions of the water problem. After data have been collected, it's important to analyze the information to identify any significant themes or trends. This can be done by organizing the information that's been collected during data gathering and data generation, and using that data then to answer some of the following questions. What similarities are apparent between the data that were gathered and the data that were generated? What differences are apparent between the data that were gathered and the data that were generated? What are the strengths and assets of this community? And in what areas is improvement needed in this community? So, for example, the neighborhood association was considered a major asset based on data that were gathered, but in the course of participant observation at meetings, some critical issues were identified. Particularly, most of the participants were owners and not renters, and many of them had strong prejudices toward the renters in the community. So think about Larson now as you review this list of characteristics of a healthy community, and consider how this list of characteristics helps you identify the healthy and the challenging aspects of life in Larson. But first, before you look at this list, it's important to ask community members about their perceptions of a healthy community. This list is based on a large volume of research, but it's not exhaustive, nor does it apply to all communities. And certainly there are many cultural variations on these themes. But it does provide you a good starting point. Now, characteristics of a healthy community on this slide deal with the experience of individual members related to the community's health. Are the individuals healthy? Do they participate in development and execution of healthy activities? Are their needs being met? Do they feel that they belong? Characteristics on this slide deal with the community's ability to support the health of those individual residents through healthy levels or forms of communication, employment, leadership. Is the community able to provide for safety and for effective crisis response? And characteristics on this last slide deal with the interaction among community members to promote the health of the whole community. Members coming together in healthy ways, such as through the election-based process. Leaders who listen to, respect, and act on the community's identified needs. Now, despite the challenges in the Larson neighborhood, there are many assets to draw on. And recently, they received the large grant that they'd been applying for to fund the project, to put in those water lines and provide access to clean water for the neighborhood. There's still a lot of work to be done, but this is a major success for them. That's the end of this presentation. Be sure to look at the involved resources for Chapter 18 that are online. Look in the Additional Resources folder for the file titled Community Assessment Applied. This provides an excellent review of the community assessment process as described in this presentation with additional examples.